Imagine a man standing on a shore in 1492. On the horizon, a shape appears that he has never seen in his life. Its wings gleam in the sunlight, gliding over the sea. From it descend beings with skin unlike his own, making strange sounds, smelling strange. For that man, it was, in every sense, a moment of invasion. But in our schools, we've always been told the story from the other side, brave explorers discovering a new world. So who actually met whom and how? And in that first moment, did both sides truly see each other as human? This is not a single moment of discovery. It's a series of collisions spread across 500 years on 4 different shores between 4 different peoples, each meeting the other in a different way. On one side, people with ships, horses, steel armor, and gunpowder. On the other, peoples who believed they had been the sole owners of their continent for at least 15,000 years, who had built their own empires, calendars, and gods. And in between, brief hours in which each side tried to make sense of the other, hours that changed the course of history. In this account, we travel through 4 scenes: the moment the Vikings set foot on the shore of North America, the moment Columbus encountered a people in the Caribbean, the moment Cortés entered the Aztec capital, and the moment Pizarro trapped an Inca emperor. In all of them, one question is the same. What happens when the person facing you doesn't see you as human? The story begins 500 years earlier than most people think. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors pushing westward from Iceland and Greenland reached the shores of present-day Canada. Leif Erikson, son of Erik Thorvaldsen, named the place Vinland, the land of grapes. But it wasn't empty. People who had already lived there for thousands of years were waiting. Norse sources called them skraeling, a derogatory term meaning roughly weak or wretched. The first contact actually began calmly. Trade. The Vikings offered red cloth in exchange for furs. According to one Norse source, the local people wanted the red cloth so badly that they barely considered the value of the furs they gave up for it. But trust didn't last. A misunderstanding, a clash, a few deaths. And within a few years, the Vikings abandoned the settlement. They were too few, too far from home, and the people facing them had no intention of giving up their land. The result, Europe forgot this encounter for nearly 5 centuries. This first contact between continents closed before it could even enter the main current of history. But in 1492, everything would change, because this time there was a force that would come back, written records, royal backing, and an unstoppable greed. On the morning of October 12th, 1492, people disembarked from 3 ships anchoring at an island in the present-day Bahamas. Facing them are people of the Taino, curious, unarmed, and remarkably hospitable. What Christopher Columbus wrote in his journal that night is striking. He described the Taino as very well built, with handsome bodies and good faces. He wrote of them swimming out to the ships, arriving with parrots, cotton thread, and gifts. In Columbus's own words, they took whatever they were given willingly. Their generosity surprised him. But a few lines later in the same journal, his real intent surfaces. He wrote that the Taino could easily be made Christians, since they appeared to have no religion. And more strikingly, he set down this sentence: with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we wish. Right here, 2 different realities collide. For the Taino, this was an encounter with new neighbors. For Columbus, it was a labor assessment. Within just a few decades of that first morning, the great majority of the island's Taino population would be wiped out, partly through violence, but far more through diseases they had never seen and had no immunity to. The people smiling on the beach that morning had no idea they were greeting their own end. 27 years later, in 1519, an encounter with a far greater power took place. Hernán Cortés, with roughly 500 men, approached one of the largest cities in the world at that time, Tenochtitlan. Its population was an estimated 250,000, more crowded than London or Paris in the same period. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II had been tracking the Spaniards' arrival for years. And when the encounter came, the Aztec reaction went beyond mere shock. 3 things left them stunned. First, their skin. They had never seen people this light-skinned. Second, firearms. The first time an arquebus was fired, the sound and smoke made not just the weapon, but the men wielding it seem supernatural. Third, and perhaps most striking, horses. There had been no horses anywhere in Mesoamerica up to that point. To the Aztecs, these four-legged creatures carrying a man roaring as they ran looked almost like a single living being, half human, half monster. Moctezuma weighed another possibility. According to prophecy, the god Quetzalcoatl was said to return with light skin. Unable to decide whether Cortés was this god or simply a stranger, he chose not to treat the Spaniards as enemies, but welcomed them into the city as honored guests. He gave gifts, showed them through the palaces. For a week, everything passed peacefully. Then news arrived of an attack on Spanish allies on the coast. Cortés panicked and took Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace. An encounter that began with hospitality would, within 2 years, end with the collapse of an empire. 13 years later, in 1532, one of history's most lopsided encounters unfolded in the Andes. Francisco Pizarro, with only 168 men, marched into the heart of one of the largest empires of the time, the Inca Empire, with a population estimated at over 10 million, stretching from Ecuador to Chile. Emperor Atahualpa came out to meet Pizarro outside the town of Cajamarca in a ceremony surrounded by thousands of his guards, almost entirely unarmed. On his own land, in the middle of his own army, he sensed no danger whatsoever, and logically he shouldn't have. Facing him were perhaps 180 men, while he had thousands of soldiers. But in Pizarro's hands were three things the Inca had never known: gunpowder, steel, and horses. Spanish cannons and arquebuses, hidden and waiting around the square, fired all at once. The sound and smoke created instant terror in a crowd that had never heard gunfire before. Armored cavalry charged into the crowd at full gallop. Within a few hours, thousands of Inca soldiers lay dead in the middle of an unarmed ceremony. On Pizarro's side, there were almost no losses. Atahualpa was taken alive. In exchange, he offered one of the largest ransoms in history. A vow to fill the room he stood in with gold. The ransom was paid, and Pizarro had him executed anyway. An empire was, in effect, left leaderless in a single afternoon. But in none of these four encounters was the truly decisive force gunpowder, horses, or steel. The most devastating thing the Europeans carried to the continent was something invisible. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The peoples of the Americas had never been exposed to these diseases for thousands of years. Their immunity was zero. Historians estimate that within a century of contact, up to 90% of the population of the Americas died of disease. In some regions, epidemics reached a city before Spanish soldiers ever did. Some indigenous peoples encountered the disease Europe brought before they ever encountered a single European. Cortés's 500 men could not have brought down Tenochtitlan alone, but a smallpox epidemic that struck the city soon after wiped out much of its population and broke its ability to resist. The real invasion, in other words, was won not on the battlefield, but on a front that was never seen and never understood. Now for a moment, think of this story in reverse. From the Aztec point of view, beings arrived not from the sky but from the sea, armed with technology never seen before, speaking an unknown language, wielding devices that spit fire, riding creatures unlike any known animal. What would we call this if it happened today? We would probably call it an invasion. We might not even call it contact. We'd call it an attack. For 5 centuries, European history has told this story as discovery. But for the side being discovered, it was no different from encountering a being with incomprehensible powers descending from their own skies. Perhaps the point is this: the difference between invader and explorer often comes down to who gets to write the story. So where do you think you'd stand in this story?